So I tend to talk too fast anyway. I have a 45-minute deck and 12 minutes to do it in. I'm sure you've all been there. So I'm going to skip a bunch of slides and probably talk too fast. Let me start off by explaining my bias. We have an integrated practice of consultants and lawyers who provide sourcing advisory services from the beginning of a deal through the doing the deal, through setting the strategy to the governance. We very largely only represent customers, so we have a very customer bias, but we understand where the suppliers come from, and we spend a lot of time trying to understand that. I'm getting a little feedback, if you could. What I want to talk about today is, I want to use this, but I don't want the feedback on the is three ideas that we've come up with that we think help people do better sourcing transactions. There's substantial industry experience in how to do these deals, and the way people have typically done this is through a set of templates and models. And in our view, this is an immature approach. It doesn't produce the right solution. And so the three ideas I'm going to talk to you about today are ideas to produce a better solution and a better relationship. One of the things we've seen is people have prescriptive approaches. And by using the methodologies I'm going to talk about today, and of course everybody has a different approach to it, is we use a specialized method to approach different problems and let each of the potential suppliers come out with the best solution that meets their ability to deliver the solution. And so the three solutions I want to talk to about today are value chain, cost marking, and unlike certain presidential candidates, I'm going to remember my third one, the retained solution. The first of the problems that we are trying to deal with, let me set forth the problem, and then I'll talk about the solution of the value chain. One of the issues in these transactions is how do you get the suppliers and the customers to align on what the scope is in a business deal. But also, how do you align when you have multiple suppliers? What's the right solution to make sure the scope of work that's designed for each supplier links up properly with the scope of work for the other suppliers? Additionally, how in a competitive deal, one of my colleagues was talking about what a typical RFP is this is the way we want you to solve the problem. And we don't think that's the right approach. We think the right approach is to describe the problem, give the supplier a tentative solution to the problem, but then let each supplier, if you're going to do a multi-supplier RFP, come up with their own proposed solution to your problem. All of the examples I'm going to use today are IT solutions, but this works for almost anything. And so we think the solution to how you describe scope is not a 200-page character-based document that describes all the little nuances. That's a wonderful snapshot of what the customer's problem was the day you signed the contract, but isn't a very good roadmap for how the businesses are going to work together. So we think that, and I may skip a slide for a second to get to the value chain. We think that if you describe what you want to do in an X and Y matrix and you put all the words in the back using industry standard definitions, and then you ask the suppliers to say which of these are the things that you're going to provide, which are the things we're going to provide, and you can then take each of the suppliers' responses in an RFP and you can choose the right supplier for the right solution. Now, one of the beautiful things about doing this, which we did not intend when we started doing this, but it turned out to be a beautiful part of the solution, is if you have outsourced to 3 different suppliers for your, let's say, your IT infrastructure, every supplier has the exact same scope document. It's just different suppliers are color-coded differently in your value chain. And so you don't have the situation where you've got an IT infrastructure supplier for the mainframe saying something's not their responsibility, and yet the mid-range guy says it isn't his responsibility. I'm going to slip back to where I was. It helps you, if you have a value chain like that, come up with your strategy. So when you're sitting down and you're just trying to figure out, what do I want to outsource, what's outsourceable, it presents a very good visual picture for people to understand their business and to understand what the solution is that they're looking for from a supplier. Now, if I had 45 minutes, I would get into the detail of how along the X and the Y axis, you can describe different businesses at different layers of your value chain. So you might want to say, if you were a jet engine aircraft manufacturer and you built light bulbs, you might want to talk about your jet aircraft business in one thing and your lighting business in another thing. But you can easily rotate those axes and say, how do I do things in France? Secondly, if you use a value chain, it sets forth in terms of the scope which actor among all the different actors, the service providers, the internal service providers, is responsible for what performance. The next beautiful thing is you don't find yourselves in the situation which you were talking about of you've cut a business deal, the consultants are all done, and then for the first time the lawyers come in and they say, well, this doesn't work, and want to reinvent it. It's a flow-through process that you start with as you're coming up with your strategy. It works for your scope definition, it works for your RFP, and the diagram becomes part of the contract. And the words behind the diagram are the same, they're ITEL specifications, and they're the same words between all your different suppliers. We actually find that for the suppliers who've gone through this process with us, there's little to no negotiation over how the words are going to work. And what you do is you take a 30-day to 6-week process and you turn it to 2 or 3 days to talk about what the scope is. And you have a lot less disagreement when you get to the end of what was in scope and what was out of scope. And then finally, the beauty of the value chain is it gives you a contract and a relationship document that's workable. When we first integrated our consulting business and our legal business, we brought the consultants in with our organization, and they studied what we were doing for 60, 90, 120 days. And they said to us, you know, you lawyers are really good. You have created the perfect contract. It describes the situation on the day that the outsourcing occurred perfectly, and it's completely and totally useless. And we said, tell us more. But that's the problem with the typical scope document. It's a great snapshot of the way things are. But the one constant in any outsourcing deal and in business these days is that things are going to change, and they're going to change quickly. And of course, as we get further and further along in time, the business cycles that when I started in the business world, you'd have a 5-year business cycle. Business cycles are now 30 days, 60 days. You don't have the luxury of renegotiating something every 5 years. The world changes much faster than that. So that's the first solution to the problems we're looking at. The second solution, the second idea I want to talk about is cost marking. Very often we're retained by somebody who says, I think I want to outsource, and I've got all these strategic reasons why I want to outsource, but I need to save money too. Saving money in these deals is necessary, but it's not sufficient. But it's necessary. And traditionally, the way you would deal with a customer who wanted to figure out if they were going to save money is you ran an RFP process. And you saw what the price was that you were quoted by each of 2 or 3 suppliers, and they would all lie in order to stay in the game long enough for the time to get real. But the problem, of course, is it was very disruptive to the customer's organization. It's very expensive. It's not fair to the suppliers, and it was much too far down the path. Another alternative when you had that situation was you could have done a benchmarking. But a benchmarking is actually too precise. It's too much work. So the second solution we've come up with is something we call cost marking. It's our second idea. And it helps us sit down with clients early on in a transaction, or at least a strategy discussion, and say, okay, you're spending $100 million now. Your strategy is you don't want to do a deal unless you're saving at least 20%. We don't think your organization is so efficient, or the nature of what it is that you're running is so specialized that you either can or cannot save that money. And it doesn't take a lot of time. But time is something I don't have, since I have this clock here ticking that tells me I have less than 2 minutes left. We find that very quickly we can do a cost marketing exercise that will tell a client within 2 or 3% what the final price of the deal is going to be. It also assists in a bid evaluation process. If you do a cost marking, you can find that relatively there's 2 or 3 items in your price that are driving the big dollar items. Now, they're typically not volume items, they're price items. You may have some mainframe computers that are costing you an enormous amount of money, and if you've got a little bit of print, it doesn't really matter what you're spending on print. It matters on the big ticket items. A cost marking also helps you with your price negotiation. If you know what it costs the vendor to supply the service to you, and you know approximately what's a fair markup for the vendor, you should be able to know where you're going to get to on the price. And one of the things that means is you don't have to do a competitive procurement every time. If you have a vendor that you really like, that you're otherwise aligned with, but you want to be able to assure management that you're going to be able to get, that you've gotten a fair price, then a cost marking exercise is a really good way of validating whether you've got the right price. Finally, most of these deals have benchmarking clauses, because the paradigm of the deal is the vendor's going to say to you, I need you to make a commitment of 7 to 10 years, or these days 5 years, but in order to be able to recover my costs, I need to know, customer, you're making a commitment to me. And the problem, of course, is the customer's willing to do that, but they need to know that they're not going to be paying an out-of-market price for a very long period of time. And so a cost marking helps you establish whether or not you want to do a benchmarking, which of course is the formal process in a contract to go out and figure out whether you're paying the right price. Then the last of our ideas, now you've probably noticed I'm on about the 4th slide of a 45-page deck. The last slide is the retained solution. We think people talk about governance a lot more than they actually do it. We think that in a deal where you've taken the value chain and you've described your organization and what services are in and out, that you ought to use the value chain as a basis to build your retained organization, especially for people who are doing their first large institutional transaction. They tend to cut off their 2 arms. The arms are the things that go to the supplier, and when they try to build their new organization that's going to manage the supplier, what they're looking for is arms, because they're used to having arms. And what they need to do is to focus on what are the high friction areas and build a retained organization that's going to work best with the vendor, that's going to achieve the goals that we've all been talking here about having an optimal solution. So I've run out of time. You haven't seen the rest of my deck. If anybody's interested in the full deck, send me an email and I'll be happy to forward it along. Thank you.